I do not know what thoughts Dr. Chomsky will share with us tonight, but I have a feeling he will not let us rest on our laurels or hide behind simple partisan politics. Being a Democrat does not mean we are automatically good or automatically right, and I have no doubt Dr. Chomsky will remind us in this crucial history-making moment that we have greater responsibilities than just voting blue. It is my absolute, unadulterated, and utter fanboy pleasure to introduce you to a hero of mine since the very first time I heard Ronald Reagan speak, and I thought to myself, oh my God, what a crock of shit. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Noam Chomsky.
How's that? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Professor. We can hear you.
I'm always amazed when technology works. Thank you very much for your comments. In fact, thank you all. I've been listening with great appreciation to the words that were spoken, the musical interludes, but I do have one reservation. There was one comment that I'd like to take issue with. Maybe I can start with that. Katie Hobbs said, this is the most important election in our lifetimes, which is not false, but highly misleading. This is the most important election that has ever taken place. That's not an exaggeration. Think about it. Human species has been around for a couple 100,000 years, lots of problems, lots of terrible events have taken place. There has never been a time when we had to make a decision as to whether organized human life on Earth will persist. We have to make that decision now. We don't have much time, a couple of decades perhaps. If we don't make it, the longer we delay, the harder it's going to be to achieve that result. And the means to achieve it are within our hands, but the decision has to be taken. Is this an exaggeration? Well, turn to the Trump administration. One of their documents, interesting document, was a long, several hundred-page environmental assessment program by the Bureau that deals with transportation. Careful assessment of the environment, well done. Drew a conclusion, said, on our present course, by the end of the century, the temperature will have risen 7 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level. Everyone who's minimally acquainted with the scientific literature knows that this is a total cataclysm, unthinkable. That's what we're heading for. And then they drew some recommendations. They said we should not impose emissions restrictions on cars and trucks, light trucks. In other words, we're heading for cataclysmic disaster, so let's get there faster. That's the message. It's not unique. This is characteristic of everything the administration has done. Regrettably, everything the Republican Party has done since John McCain, who was the last Republican nominee leader to pay some attention, not enough, but some attention to the rising, increasing threat of environmental catastrophe. And it's not just the destruction of organized human society, it's also the destruction of much of life on Earth. As I'm sure all of you know, we're in the midst of what's called the 6th extinction. 5th extinction was 65 million years ago, huge asteroid hit the Earth, caused disasters. About 75% of species were wiped out. End of the age of the dinosaurs. Left some space for some small mammals who then proliferated. They finally created a unique and rather special mammal, different from any other organism on Earth, namely us. And we are now driving to be the second asteroid. Species are disappearing at a remarkable rate, much faster than 65 million years ago. Not just animal species. One of the latest science journals I read a couple of days ago estimated that about 40% of plant life is disappearing. A lot of it is due to overheating of the atmosphere, what's euphemistically called climate change, should be called boiling of the atmosphere. A lot of it is due to other things like habitat destruction, grotesque agricultural processes and others. Same things happening all over. A couple of years, probably mid-century, the weight of plastics in the ocean will be greater than the weight of fish. Effect of this on food life around the Earth is inestimable. We're now approaching a point, a level of heat that was not reached. The last time it was reached with 125,000 years ago. At that point, the sea level was about roughly 25 feet higher than it is now. The gap between now and 125 years from now, 125 years ago, could be filled by the melting of the Arctic ice sheets. What's happening is shocking scientists, escalating. No one really knows exactly where it'll lead, but it is extremely menacing. All of this can be stopped by means that are achievable at a feasible cost with basically known technology, but it's not going to happen to ourselves. We have President Trump, who is dedicated to keeping his foot on the accelerator, to saying, let's get there as quickly as possible, because that increases profits for fossil fuel companies, big banks that lend to them. In other words, his primary constituency. He has two interests: keeping his primary constituency happy, super rich, corporate system, and his own personal prospects. That's it. What happens to the country, what happens to the world, doesn't matter. And regrettably, he's supported by a political party that has simply drifted off the rails. That's one reason why this is the most important election in human history. Nothing like it. Literally the continuation of organized human society is at stake. 4 more years of these policies might carry us to irreversible tipping points, in which case it's finished, or it will almost certainly move to the point where trying to deal with the imminent catastrophe will be far harder. It's still possible. 4 more years of racing towards disaster will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible. That's only one reason. There's another reason. You want to think about it? I think a good place to start is the best simple indicator that we have of the state of the world. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. Every January, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, main scientific journal, brings together a group of top scientists, other political analysts. They try to give an assessment of the security state of the world. They encapsulate this in what's called in the doomsday clock, certain number of minutes to midnight. Midnight means we're finished. It was set in 1947, wake of the atom bomb, 7 minutes to midnight. It oscillated over the years depending on conditions. Ever since President Trump has been elected, the minute hand has moved towards midnight. This last January, the analysts abandoned minutes. I should say 2 years ago, it reached the closest point it had ever been. This year, they abandoned minutes, moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight. They gave 3 reasons. This is before the pandemic was understood. It had begun, but wasn't understood. And incidentally, though the pandemic is very severe, the world will recover from it at terrible cost, needless cost, particularly in countries with malevolent and incompetent leadership. 3 are at the top: United States, Brazil, and India. 3 countries with increasingly autocratic, anti-scientific leadership. The top. It's needless. We can see that from the experience of other countries which were in more dangerous situations, but where the political leadership cared enough about the population to take actions as soon as it was understood what the threat was. It was understood on January 10th. January 10th, China provided the world with the source of the what is now a pandemic, the virus, and sequenced the virus, gave all the information to virologists all over the world, World Health Organization. Those who cared to do something did so. The United States is a disaster, the worst disaster in the world, followed closely by Brazil and India. The countries in East Asia reacted very quickly. Even South Korea, which had a very serious epidemic, quickly contained it by measures that are easily available to us. They didn't even have to have a lockdown. Now things are pretty much under control. Same with Taiwan, same with Singapore, same with New Zealand, same with Australia, same with Vietnam, which has had barely any cases, even though it has a 1,400-kilometer border with South China. States in Africa have contained it: Senegal, Liberia, Kenya, countries with very weak health systems, but the governments reacted. Some in Europe, some less so. The United States stands out, and the reason goes right back to the White House. But nevertheless, it will sooner or later be overcome. The melting of the Arctic ice sheets will not be overcome. That's finished. It's there in the atmosphere for all practical purposes permanently. And it's getting worse, fat, sometimes even growing non-linearly, it seems. That's one problem. But that's not that's only one of the reasons why the doomsday clock is moving to midnight. There's others. The second one is one which is equally dangerous and amazingly is not being discussed. I didn't hear a word about it at either of the 2 conventions, maybe a slight reference here and there. That's the increasing threat of nuclear war, increasing threat. leading specialists on this topic, like William Perry, not given to exaggeration, spent his entire career on the nuclear issues, former Secretary of Defense, says he's doubly terrified by the growing threat, terrified by the fact that there's almost no attention to it. And it is very serious. President Trump has been escalating the threat by tearing to shreds the arms control regime, which offered some defense against the threat of terminal disaster. And anyone who's looked at the record of the last 75 years knows that it's almost a miracle that we've survived this far. The third danger that was identified by the analysts is the deterioration of democracy. Now, at first, it doesn't sound as if that should rank with environmental catastrophe and terminal nuclear war. But if you think about it, it does. There's only one way to control, contain, and overcome the existential threats. That's with a vibrant democracy in which informed, engaged citizens take affairs into their own hands, work to ensure that these crises will be overcome, and many others, because this is hardly the only problem in our society. Well, what's happened since January? President Trump has carried out a pretty impressive achievement. He has managed to increase every one of these threats. Environmental catastrophe opened up new huge areas for oil drilling. Last nature reserve in the United States in Alaska, huge area. His administration, the relevant bureaus are now in the hands of businessmen dedicated solely to profit. Wheeler, others, have been step by step eliminating the regulations which not only offer us some protection, they somewhat mitigate the effects of climate disaster, but they also protect the population, keep the water from being poisoned, cut back chemicals that cause brain damage in children, throw them all out, step by step. Almost every day there's another one that comes along. The arms control regime, well, the last step, last August, before that was already calculated in January, threw out the INF treaty, negotiated by Reagan and Gorbachev. Let's get rid of that. Since January, get rid of the Open Skies Treaty, initiated by Dwight Eisenhower. Get rid of that. Next, the last one is the New START Treaty, due to be ratified in February. The United States has been delaying on frivolous grounds. Russians have been calling for renegotiating it. No, by now it's possibly too late. If Trump is in office, it's finished. No more arms control treaties. And that's only a part of it. Remember last August, when the INF treaty was discarded, immediately, within days, the United States sent off missiles that violated. That's a signal to everybody else. Don't pay any attention to this. You create missiles that can destroy us, and it'll escalate. Okay? Same with all the others. Pouring money into new, highly threatening, highly destructive weapons, which greatly increase the danger of terminal nuclear war, or an extreme danger to the American population and everyone else. Well, what about deterioration of democracy? I hardly have to tell you. the executive branch of the government has been purged of any independent voice. Nothing left but sycophants. There happened to be a system of laws in the United States. It says presidential appointments have to be confirmed by the Senate. That's too much trouble for a tin pot dictator. So you don't make the appointments. Just make temporary appointments so they don't have to be confirmed. The latest one was the highest Pentagon position in the executive. It looked like Congress wasn't going to confirm it. Good, just appoint it temporarily. Senator Grassley, senior Republican senator, 89 years old, had spent much of his career developing a system of inspectors general to monitor executive offices, ensure that there's no corruption, malfeasance, and so on. They were beginning to look into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington. Simple solution: fire them and go out of your way to humiliate Senator Grassley, who did react mildly, but with no support from the Republican Party. Want to humiliate a senior Republican leader? That's fine. Okay, that's barely the beginning of deterioration of democracy. We've seen more in the last couple of weeks. Trump has repeatedly, openly, publicly stated that if he doesn't like the outcome of the election, he won't leave. Can't go beyond that. And that is taken very seriously. I'm sure you've read columns in the press, major columnists, articles in the journals, Barton Gellman, Atlantic, others. Two senior military officials, highly regarded senior officials, retired, General John Nagel, Lieutenant Colonel Yingling, released an open letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, reminding him, reviewing for him his constitutional responsibilities if the president refuses to leave office after losing an election. Said, your duty is to send the Army, send the 82nd Airborne, whatever it takes, force him out of office. This is reaffirmed by others. There's a high-level transition integrity project, Republicans and Democrats, high-level figures in both parties, other political analysts. They've been meeting for some years to actually carry out war games on the possible outcome of the election. The very fact that this is going on is beyond shocking, but they do run war games. On every scenario, unless Trump wins outright, every other scenario leads to some form of civil conflict. You may have heard that I think just today, the orders were given for the Arizona National Guard to mobilize along with the Alabama National Guard to be ready to act to take care of violent civil conflict if after the election, and this is the only plausible form of civil conflict. Arizona's responsibility is the West, Alabama's the East. Things like that have never happened before. In the entire history of parliamentary democracy, there are a few moments like the Civil War and so on, but beyond really outlandish moments, there's never been anything like this. And that's the three major issues. Every one of them made worse. Well, that's what's coming up in November 3rd. The very fact that we're talking about who to vote for in this election seems to be a scandal. There has never been such a dangerous figure in political power. No one ever has been dedicated to destroying life on Earth. Why are the treaties being destroyed? Because Trump has one idea in mind. If there's a treaty, it's the worst treaty that was ever created. Let's get rid of it. I'll create the best deal that was ever created. One after another, every one disastrous. The most recent one, a couple of weeks ago, was the COVAX consortium. There's an international consortium which is working on cooperation in developing a vaccine for the pandemic and working on distributional problems. How can we ensure that the rich and powerful don't just monopolize it and everyone else dies? That's what they're working on. How well they're working, we don't know, but they're working on it. Trump helped out a couple of weeks ago by saying the United States is pulling out. We're not going to be part of that. It's an international effort, therefore it's the worst thing that ever happened, so we're going to pull out. Only one phrase in the vocabulary, wreck it, okay? That's the way to treat anything. In this case, what does it mean to pull out? Well, it means it's going to be harder to develop a vaccine. It also means if the vaccine is developed by others, the United States will be a laggard. So the American people are sacrificed again. Who cares? I'll look like a big shot. There was a pretext for pulling out. Pretext was the World Health Organization is involved. Now, Trump very naturally wants to destroy the World Health Organization. He has to find a scapegoat for the fact that he is responsible for killing tens of thousands of Americans. Work through the arithmetic, it's probably 150, 160,000 Americans killed just because of failure to take measures that work very well in countries where the leadership cares about the population. Can't face that, so we have to find a scapegoat. Who can the scapegoat be? Well, China, World Health Organization, blue state governors, whoever you can blame it on. Trying to destroy the World Health Organization has an effect. It means that unknown numbers of people, huge numbers, in Africa, in Yemen, and other poor countries, lose the support on which they rely for security treatment against a raft of diseases. Let's pull it away, killing who knows how many people because I want to improve my electoral prospects. Well, I agree. That's not on the scale of saying, let's destroy the prospects for human life, but it's another piece of the same puzzle, same picture. That's what's at stake in this election. It's not just the most important election in our lifetimes. For me, since 1928, it's the most important election ever. And it's the most important decision in the history of the world. It's not an exaggeration. Well, suppose somehow we get this malignant. Incidentally, it's not just the presidency. The same is true of the Senate and the House of Representatives. If they're in the hands of a party that is totally in Trump's pocket, that has drifted off the rails, that is no longer a normal political party, mainstream, sober political commentators, highly regarded, Thomas Mann, Norman Ornstein of the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, described today's Republican Party as a radical insurgency, which has abandoned parliamentary means. We see that constantly. Mitch McConnell's Senate, the Senate used to be called the world's greatest deliberative body. In Mitch McConnell's hands, it doesn't deliberate. It does nothing. the House sends legislative proposals, Senate doesn't look at them. They have two duties. One is to pad the pockets of the super rich in the corporate sector, like their one major legislative achievement, the tax scam. The other is to stack the entire judiciary, top to bottom, with young, ultra-right lawyers who will be able to block any limited progressive action for at least a generation, meaning whatever the public wants, we'll keep our ultra-reactionary policies. I don't have to run through the Garland case for you. You all know about it, but it's only one of a whole series. This is a deep malignancy. If it remains in the Senate and the House, it's bad enough. If it remains in the White House, could be something approaching terminal disaster. It's not an exaggeration. Well, what do we do about it? Suppose you manage to get the malignancy out of the White House. Then other problems begin. Let's think about them. Now, there are two views, competing views, about the nature of politics. There is a reigning view. It's the doctrine of mainstream political science. It's advocated by leading figures, Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr, called the theologian of the establishment, Harold Lasswell, founders of political science, all incidentally what are called left liberals, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals. They have a doctrine, it goes way back actually as constitutional roots. The doctrine is that people have the role of the population, I'm quoting Lippmann, is to be spectators, not participants. The population is a bewildered herd. They are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They must be put in their place. They have a job. It's to show up every 4 years, push a button to pick one of us, and then to go home and not bother us. They have to be fed necessary illusions and emotionally potent simplifications. That's Reinhold Niebuhr. We should not be misled by democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. That's an illusion. We are the responsible men, the smart guys. So go back and you go back. You've done your job as a participant. Push the lever. Go back home. Don't bother us. As that was Lasswell. As Lippmann put it, the responsible men, that's us, have to be protected from the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd. That's you, me. We're the bewildered herd. Go home. We'll take care of things. On the side, you have corporate executives. Recently, they came out with a big manifesto saying, yeah, we realize we've done bad things in the past. Business Roundtable, this is. We've made some mistakes in the past, but don't worry, we've thought about it. I now understand those mistakes. We're now going to be working for you day and night, overtime. But just put your trust in us and go home. The 1950s, that used to be called the soulful corporation. Just put everything in our hands. We're going to take care of you. That's one view. The other view is that real politics means activism every day. You're constantly engaged in work, political work of all kinds. It could be anything from a political club to a labor union, to a school board, to the state legislature, to lobbying, to getting a street light up somewhere where you need it, whatever it is. Keep at it all the time. Community organizing, education, a whole range of activities. Every couple of years, an event comes along called an election. You take a couple of minutes, you ask, is there something at stake? If there is, okay, then you take another couple of minutes, push the lever in the voting box, get back to work. That's another conception of politics, very different from the mainstream one, okay? But the one that the people setting the doomsday clock are thinking of. That's the kind of democratic activism that can deal with the existential crises. And they're not going to end, even if we get rid of the malignancy in the White House. They're going to be there. There's a struggle inside the Democratic Party. It's pretty hard to find the details because it mostly goes on in secret, but you can see the effects. On the one hand, the base of the party, especially younger people, is increasingly becoming what is interestingly called radical in the United States. I'll come back to that word in a minute, but they're becoming radical, the Sanders movement. The DNC, the Clintonite, donor-oriented management of the party doesn't like that. And there's a struggle going on. If you've been watching things like the Democratic Party webpage and noticing the shifts up and back over the months, it's been interesting to see. You can see the symptoms of a struggle taking place. And that struggle is going to continue. What's it about? Well, take climate change. Under the pressure of real politics, that is day-to-day activism, Biden and Harris took fairly decent steps towards a program that might begin to deal with the climate catastrophe. It was on the webpage for a while, then it disappeared. Something else came. But it was not a bad program, not good enough, but much better than anything that's been there before, much better than most countries, could be pushed forward to the kind of Green New Deal that we actually need for survival and that can be implemented, not out of range. Well, that battle's going to continue. The activists, if the activists follow the rules and say we're spectators, not participants, you know who's going to win. And it's not just that issue. Take Bernie Sanders' programs, which are called radical. Liberal commentators in the press say, nice ideas, but too radical for the American people. What are they? You know what they are. His main program, which he was hammering on over and over, is universal health care. That's called too radical for the American people. Step back for a second. Can you think of any other countries that have universal health care? I mean, can you think of a country that doesn't have it? Pretty hard. It's everywhere. To our north, to our south, a couple of miles to the south of us, all of Europe, everyone has it. Too radical for the American people? Is that what polls show? Hardly. Polls you have to take pretty cautiously, but consistently they've been calling for health as a human right. Not long ago, I think was late Reagan years, polls asked the question, should health care be in the Constitution? 70% of Americans said universal health care should be in the Constitution. 40% said it's already there. The background assumption is if anything is obviously right, it must be in the Constitution. And there are other polls up and back, pretty much showing that Americans want to be like the rest of the world. We don't have to accept the idea that being like rising to the level of the rest of the world is radical. It's not. It's absolutely centrist. It's claimed that it'll be too costly. It's a very interesting calculation. It'll actually save huge amounts of money. American healthcare costs are an international scandal. Twice the level of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. The difference will be, instead of pouring the money into the pockets of the insurance industry, financial institutions, you'll be putting them into taxes to the general public, which under a democratic system could use them for a decent purpose. Incidentally, it should be mentioned that the United States does have universal health care. It's called emergency rooms. If you can drag yourself to an emergency room, they'll take care of you. Sometimes they'll take care of you very well. Top level people taking care of things that a nurse could take care of. I've seen that. I'm sure you have. It's the most cruel, sadistic, expensive form of universal health care that exists, but we have it. Is anything else too radical for us? Well, think about it. Second plank in Sanders' program is free higher education. Can ask the same question. Does anybody have it? Go a couple of miles south of us, right across the border. Poor country, very high level higher education system. I've lectured there. Very impressive. Low salaries, poor country, free. Take the country that does always the top in educational outcomes, Finland, free. Take the most successful capitalist country, Germany, free. All over the place, there's free higher education. Actually, the United States had something like free higher education when I was a student. It was called the GI Bill of Rights. It gave huge numbers of people free education, higher education, and subsidies, people who would never have gone to college. There were flaws. It was racist and sexist. No blacks, no women, because of the way the armed forces were constructed. But it was there. It was there. Did it bankrupt the country? It was very good for the country. It was one of the reasons for the great expansive growth rate of the 50s and the 60s. The golden age of capitalism, it's often called. Very good for the people, very good for the country. Even Ivy League institutions were virtually free. 1945, I went to college. I was a working student living at home to go to the local college. University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League college. Tuition was a couple of thousand. By contemporary, it was a couple $100, maybe a couple of $1,000 in today's currency. And furthermore, you could get a scholarship very easily. That's not like going to the Ivy League today. That was virtually free education, easily, and that was a much poorer country. We're much richer than we were then. All of these things are very much within reach, just like solving the problem of environmental catastrophe, nuclear war, destruction of democracy. I don't want to go on too long, I already have. The point is, we are facing serious crises, very serious. The means to solve them are within our hands. We can use them. We don't have a lot of time. They're available. We have to grasp the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. You've given us so much to think about, many of which we think about every day, but not in such an organized way. And yes, this is the most important election in history. There's no question about it. And we are working so hard. Everyone attending here this evening is working so hard. Some ladies in who can't be flipped. We want to write cards to people over 65 and tell them that Trump is going to destroy their Social Security. And so I'm gonna stop my video because I have poor bandwidth. But what these ladies did was I gave them 13,000 addresses of poor, low efficacy voters over 65, and they wrote the postcards and they paid the postage. And we are seeing people mobilizing in ways we've never seen before. It's just astounding. And then they called me yesterday and wanted 3,000 more addresses. So whether people have verbalized it or not, I think they know this is the most important election in history. And we're doing all we can. Thank you for your very wise words. And we're very grateful for you being here. So Pima Democrats, we have a lot to think about. I'll see you at the phone banks. I'll see you at the lit drops. I'll see you on Zooms. It's a month away. Let's do everything we can. Good night, everyone. I want to thank Layla Counts and Zoe Fife for being the technological wizards behind this evening. It's been wonderful to see you all. Good evening.